Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce you to John C. from Hamilton, Ontario. John has more than 50 years of sobriety. I'd like to pretend that I'm younger than that, but I'm not. He maintains an active recovery life by practicing and teaching evidence-based methods to improve his well-being. He's going to share some of those exercises and principles with us today, and they're going to really help us have a more effective, lasting change and help us work a really good program. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I can't wait.
Well, thank you, Susie. I appreciate the warm introduction and the invitation by Patrick, and I'm really excited to be with each of you today. And I see a couple of familiar names and faces, and it's always nice to look into a room like this and see some old friends. And it's also even nicer to look at some new friends. So I hope that the time we spend with each other is both valuable and formidable for both of us. And today we're going to be talking about something that's close to my heart, and that's about emotional and cognitive sobriety. And just as a way of introduction here, I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm going to not try to kill you by PowerPoint, by the way, but I wanted to keep us focused and looking at something that's valuable, I believe, for every human being who has recovered from an addiction. So this is an emotional cognitive sobriety workshop, and I call it the path of freedom. So as Susie already pointed out, I've had multiple addictions myself and over 50 years of sobriety from alcohol. I live in Hamilton, Ontario. I'm a certified mental health coach, a practitioner in positive psychology, and I'm a founder of a community called the Freedom Hour, and I'll explain a little bit about that as we go along. So I have two real missions in life. My first mission is about expanding God's consciousness, which I have belonged to a meditation group. I started two meditation groups. I believe in the strength and the power of this mystical, supernatural kind of thing that empowers us to become better and more effective people. And I have done many workshops in that area, and I've even written a book on expanding God consciousness. The Love of God is the name of it, and 50 years of sobriety and how that relates to me. My second mission is this discussion today is about emotional sobriety. And the reason why it's near and dear to me is not because of any particular genius I have. It's because I failed miserably in recovery many times with devastating results and not really understanding why. And that brought about such a curiosity for me to find out what was going on that I was not aware of, but was driving me to make certain decisions and choices in my life, forcing me to feel certain ways that contained and diminished who I was as a human being. And as a result of that, pain and suffering and devastation, if you like, out of the ashes become a keen interest in learning about what is it I can learn from the experiences of others that will help me to be emotionally free. And that doesn't mean not having emotions, by the way. It means having them and being with them, but they no longer dictate to me what I'm going to decide or choose to do in my life. And that's really the essence of what we're talking about here today. And this is such a large conversation. I'm not going to be able to nowhere cover any large part of it one day in 1 hour. So I believe these folks are inviting me back with multiple sessions to talk about other things, the solutions of what I'm going to present today. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I got sober when I was 23 years old, confused. I certainly identified with Dr. Silkworth's view of or observation of an addict. I'm restless, irritable, and discontent. And I sought comfort and ease through alcohol. Another way of saying it, I felt incomplete and I was looking for some sort of completion in an external counterfeit way. It didn't occur to me that those things I was already searching for were already in me. I was reaching out to the external world to satisfy a hole that could never be filled. When I come to the program, I believe so strongly this, that if I could only stop drinking, I would be a saint. That's how I saw it. And what occurred over time was not that at all. What occurred over time that I realized that alcohol was a symptom of my disease, and I was operating in some sort of psychological dysfunction in an unconscious way, organizing my life in such a way that made me restless, irritable, and discontent with or without alcohol. So what I will share with you is this. I want to break this thing down in stages of sobriety or abstinence. First, there's physical recovery, and that's where we pay our attention to putting down whatever substance we use to numb or to distract. And all our attention goes there, and rightfully so, it should. We put timeless hours in going to meetings or talking with other recovered people. And we really feel good about ourselves when we're on the road to the physical recovery. And this lasts, I don't know, depending on who you are, can last for weeks, months, years even. Then there's the spiritual recovery of this, when we begin to realize that we have limited power, and that really power, or the question of power, really is front and center, and how to achieve sobriety day per day after day. And we get into the spiritual recovery and come to believe in a power greater than ourselves, which will restore us to some sanity, which is great. And that works really well over time. And all of a sudden, you're confronted with cognitive and emotional sobriety. In other words, we begin to see how our emotions, our negative thinking, our inner critic, our limited beliefs are containing us from free self-expression. And here's another bit of an additional journey. I mean, that's all this is. And I think about in Bill Wilson's letter, in the Grapevine, talking about the next frontier. He was 18 years sober. And he come to realize that he was suffering from depression. Now, I don't know if he knew it before but he was prepared to write about it at that moment. And I think this is much of our journey, when we come to a place where we might say to ourselves, is this all there is? There's just got to be more. My life is just like, it's okay. But you know what? There's a yearning and an urging inside of me that has not yet been satisfied. And this is our journey into what we would call emotional sobriety, or the professionals would call emotional regulation. So each of these phases of recovery can be challenges. Each of them have their own challenges, their own detours, and their own, construction sites, if you like, to overcome and to deal with. Each are very unique. So we're not talking today about emotional or physical sobriety or spiritual sobriety. We're really speaking today about emotional cognitive sobriety. The first thing I want you to present to you is an idea, a concept, a theory, if you like. But in a human being, we cannot just pull out our emotions and start to work on emotions. See, that triangle, it works together. You can't pull away the emotions and say, I'm going to work on my emotional sobriety, and that's what I'm going to do. It's not like that. There is an interplay, a connection between thought, emotion, and behaviors. And by the way, they're bidirectional. So sometimes our emotions will affect our behaviors, and sometimes our behaviors will affect our emotions. And just to give you a simple exercise on that, just take a moment and slouch in your chair. Just slouch. And what you may find as you're slouching in your chair is that the energy starts to drain and that you're feeling less active. Now just brush that off for a moment and sit upright with your shoulders back. And then you can almost feel the energy returning. You feel alert. You feel aware. See, this is how this interplay works. And often the interplay works at a subconscious level. In other words, we don't even realize it. We're not aware that it exists. Our thoughts play with our behaviors. Every time there's a behavior, there's a thought before that. Oh, I'm going to go to the store. There's examples of thought. Then you get up and you go to the store. So thoughts interplay with our behaviors as well as our emotions. I feel like heck today. I don't feel very good. Well, that's a thought. And then what the emotions do is react to the statement and delivers this emotion of not feeling so well. So to think that we can say just talk about our emotions today would be an error. It would be incomplete. We want to keep this, we must keep this triangle together. And that's why I've added in emotional and cognitive sobriety, because they cannot be separated. So first thing I'd like to talk to you about is this. Heart and brain work together, but it is our relationship to them is the problem. So one might say, well, you know what? I'm feeling anxious, and that's a bad emotion. There's something wrong with me. But what that emotion is, it isn't bad. It's my relationship to the anxiousness that's really the difficulty or challenge. See, we try, and this is where I think many of us go awry, and I certainly had for many years. I thought it was the anxiousness I had to squash, to avoid, to suppress, to pretend it didn't exist. Or I had to self-examine who I was because I felt anxious. You see, neither of those patterns work at all. They don't work. They work in our disfavor, actually. They make us feel less than. So it's my relationship to the emotions and my thoughts are really what's key here. So I really want us to separate those two things. Oftentimes we've collapsed them together, and what I want to do is to separate it. What I can't control is how I feel, but I can control how I relate to the feeling I'm having. So another way of me saying this, I honor my experiences, whether they are embarrassing, painful, disruptive. I honor it because that's what I am having in front of me. And to pretend it's some other way creates a whole bunch of other difficulties. Avoidance is a very big problem when dealing with emotions. Next thing we want to look at in ourselves, what are we? Are we a willow or are we an oak? A willow is called soft wood. An oak is hardwood. The soft wood may appear penetrable, easy to break open. A hardwood would be hard to break, one would think. But it's just the opposite. You see, a willow will bend to the wind. You see, it's malleable. It will adjust. An oak stands rigid, firm, defensive. And in the wind, it breaks. The trunk cracks. See, we in the recovery, we want to be more like the willow, willing to adapt, no matter how much sobriety one has or abstinence one has. We want to be open. We want to be expanding and growing and becoming something that maybe God has always intended us to become. And that is to fulfill our sacred identity. So in this, what we're talking about us today in this workshop, let us be a willow for a moment. Let us just, for the next 45 minutes, allow ourselves to move and adjust to the wind and bend, no matter what our beliefs are. and just be open. Next thing I want you to consider is this. We think we're living reality, right? We are so sure that we are operating life on life's terms, we don't even give it a second thought. Oh, this is the reality. This is my truth. We have all kinds of expressions like that really define the certainty of life. And all of that is false. You see, we don't operate in reality. We operate in our occurring, our perspective. And this is very important to realize and come to know before we get into our work today. It is because we are perceiving people, that we're sensing people. We need to realize how we're sensing things may be open to challenge, to put it to the test, not to be so certain about what is actually happening. Remembering always that this is an occurring. This is how it occurs to me. So one might say, you know what, I'm not good enough. Oh, wait a second. Is that how it occurs to you? Well, yeah, I'm not good enough. One could argue, yes, you are. You are good enough. And what you're expressing is an occurring over certain situations that you have come to a conclusion that you're not good enough. And what you've come to a conclusion with is false. You see, the dignity of a human being is that each of us are good enough. Whether we suffer from an addiction or we fully recovered from addiction, we are still good enough. We are greater than our disease, and we're far greater than our defects of character as we try to define them. So always remember, it's an occurring. It's not a truth, nor is it a reality. How's this so far? Is it okay? So I'm going to be challenging with some uncomfortable things today, and maybe even some popular myths. I know in the next slide I'm going to be challenging with an unpopular or a popular myth that you may not believe. But what I want to tell you is this is science-based information. So it's not John saying to you, there's my opinion. Here is my experience coupled with evidence-based scientific results of what's happening in the world of emotional regulation. First myth, weakness focused. We in recovery rooms have over-invested ourselves in our weaknesses. And we've collapsed something here that's so vitally important that we need to separate. That our weaknesses diminishes our self-worth. I want to repeat that because you really need to appreciate this. And I want you to investigate what I'm saying. Where we have over-invested in our weaknesses. And we also equate our weaknesses to our self-worth. In other words, I have weaknesses, therefore I'm not worthy. See, we have this self-image about ourselves that we kind of grew into. We didn't really intend to write this story, by the way. We didn't sit down with a notebook and say, here's my life story. This is how I come to know myself. But in fact, that's what's happened ever since childhood. What we've done is we created what I call a me story, a me story. And it's a compilation of all the experiences I have, trying to understand the world, trying to understand my parents and other authority figures, and try to make sense out of it. And from that, I use some incomplete judgment about myself as a result of, or the outcome of, or the impact of what happened. And this all gets stored away in the brain, which is incredible when you think about it, because how does all that information ever get stored? But it does. And a lot of that information is not only useless, not only false, it's destructive and harmful. And in some ways, I think that's what starts addiction rolling is the self-image that we have about ourselves. As Dr. Silkworth once again observed, we were restless, irritable, and discontent. And we searched for something that provide us with comfort and ease, something to avoid pain, something that we can feel good about. See, it all starts with this me story and the judgments I have about myself. Now, it doesn't take a genius to listen to people or listen to yourself and really expose what that me story is. When we talk about our weaknesses, as I am, as an example, at the level of identity, we speak about I am self-centered. So if you believe in the center of your identity that you are self-centered, what is the behavior? It can only be self-centeredness or in the fringes of self-centeredness. There's no freedom there. Versus, yes, I have some selfish moments. You see, there's the difference. There's a behavior and there's identity. We have collapsed this through good intention, by the way. I'm not saying we did it intentionally wrong or bad, through good intention to try to uncover who we are as a person. But unfortunately, for many of us, the way we did it, we polluted our garden of our sacred identity. And therefore, we come to know ourselves as self-centered. And we walk around like a bird with a bruised wing. Oh, look at me. I'm self-centered. What would you expect? What is a self-centered person to do but other than do what I do? After all, I'm addicted. We come to accept something less than our full expression. And this is the overinvestment of a weakness focus. And you'll notice in this continuum here, if I could see this thing here, if they have a zero of indifference, when we're focusing on our defects of character, the objective is the duration and the intensity of the defective character. In other words, if I can do that less, and I can lessen the intensity, I will have shown progress. And that's true. There is some good out of that. But what we're missing is this side of the continuum, where we develop and work towards flourishing. Now, in psychology, there's only two ways to go. One is avoidance, and the other one's approaching. Towards or away from. Very simple. What we want to do is work towards flourishing, to be a fully functioning human being able to be fully self-expressed. And the way to do that is not to work on weaknesses of character. Why? We all have them. It is a human condition. Weaknesses are separate from their worthiness. They're not the same thing. So by accepting the fact that we're flawed, and we know that intellectually, by the way, we say things like, well, I'm not perfect. I'm only human. We say it. But in our experience, something else happens. In our experience, we hit ourselves over the head. And in the quiet places in our mind, we say, what's wrong with you? Here you go again. How can I possibly be so stupid? These are the examples that we use in our experience versus we say to someone else, well, I'm not perfect. And what we really want to get to is how we experience these things. What is our relationship to these things? To begin to understand, but what we're missing. The other piece is strength focus. Again, this conversation is missing out of many 12-step rooms. And this is the reason why I started my community, the Freedom Hour, was to infuse conversations around strengths, to approach flourishing or thriving, or to be a fully functioning human being who is fully self-expressed. This is the conversation that's missing, friends. And if you're not in this conversation, find a few people and be in that, create the conversation. Because this, what gets us to emotional regulation, is spotting the development and the expression of our strengths. You know, just as a test, friends, after you leave the room today, go ask a 12-step friend of yours and ask them, would you share a defective character that you have with me? And they'd be probably more than happy to do so. They're going to articulate it perfectly. They're going to give it to you from all angles. They're going to tell you exactly what happened. They're going to explain all of that stuff. They're going to explain their frustration on it and everything. And sit and listen to their conversation. And then ask them this: what good are you? What strength do you have? A signature strength. And watch the eyes. I call them fish eyes. They glaze over. They're not sure. And it's not that they don't have strengths, by the way. It's just that they're not nurturing those strengths. They're not paying attention to those strengths. They're not improving those strengths. You know, I equate it to this, and I imagine, like, I have an 8-year-old granddaughter who is very creative. And some of the creation, by the way, has caused me some difficulties because she likes to make potions. And that equates a mess for me. But I sit and watch her do her work, what she calls her work. And I encourage her. And I say, you know, this is so good. Tell me what you were thinking about when you did that. Wow, that is spectacular. And what I do is infuse the energy that she has to encourage her to do something that she enjoys. And I'll tell you, her eyes tell the story. It does sparkle when I talk to her, just sparkle. Well, that's not to be left with children, to nurture that creativity. It is to be done with ourselves and with people that we care about. We need to be a group of people that encourages each other to develop the strengths we have, and to pay attention and help them, inspire them to continue to grow along their strengths. Now, oddly enough, strength development and strength expression are places where our emotional regulation happens easily. It is a byproduct of that. Now, so what is emotional sobriety? What contributes to emotional sobriety? There's all kinds of definitions, I'm sure, out there. It is, and I'm not saying any of them are narrow or wrong or anything like that, but this is what I believe. Emotional sobriety is a result. It's a result of something. Now, I can't explain. Bill Wilson's thought was our love of God and service will give us emotional sobriety. I can't argue with that. But what I can say to you is that there are many mature, sober people who in themselves admit that they have emotional sobriety. They've done the work, they help people, they speak, they do big book studies, they do all these things that we're told to do, and yet there is an emptiness there. So the result isn't necessarily that we each are going to find emotional sobriety in our 12-step work. So we got to be real about this. We got to be, what is my true experience? What contributes to emotional sobriety directly? And the first thing I want to point out is mindfulness. You know, social scientists will say to us that we, in our waking hours, are asleep half the time. Now, I want to repeat this because this statistic is staggering. In other words, when we're awake, we're not aware. We're asleep. Half of our lives, our waking lives, we are somewhere else. Now, we may be there physically, but emotionally and mentally, we're not. Now, what the brain does in this case, it forms habits so that it doesn't have to think. I like you to think that the brain is a stingy organ. It's always protecting its energy because it might be called on in an emergency. So what it does, it preserves energy. And we as human beings, what we do to compensate the energy is form habits. Now, for any addict, many of those habits are destructive, unhealthy, and unwise. And if we are operating out of this half awake, half aware, we're going to miss many of those habits. We're going to continue on with them because we're not awake. So what do we do to get awake? There's a practice called mindfulness. Now, everybody has an opinion about mindfulness. Everybody thinks about meditation as an example. And meditation is part of being mindful, but it isn't mindfulness. Mindfulness is a little bit unique and a little bit different. Mindfulness is the state that we're fully awake and aware of the experiences that we're having in the moment. And that we're having that experience without judgment, with understanding and curiosity. And we're paying attention to our body sensations. In other words, our body and heart are being connected here. Many of us, including myself, have disconnected my heart, my feelings, because it was a source of pain for me. I rather think my way through life than feel my way through life. So I have disconnected and had disconnected for many years my body sensations. And here's an interesting thing. See, the mind will lie. My mind has the capacity to lie. Now, just to clean it up a bit, spin, justify, rationalize. This is what my mind's capable of being. And yet, the body never lies. It has no capacity to lie. So when I'm in touch with my body sensations, the universe or nature is giving me true feedback of what's happening. While being mindful now, I can make certain choices about old habits I have. Am I going to participate in that old habit, or am I going to do something else? And I make a better choice. So the adult John has a better choice of making a better decision than the habit that I created many years ago. This is mindfulness. It's a practice. It's a development. It is the daily practice of being awake. I already talked to you about maximizing strengths as part of contributing to emotional sobriety. Positive relationships. What does positive relationships do with emotional regulation? Well, I'll tell you. Could you imagine being in a relationship, and maybe you are in this relationship, that there's betrayal and distrust and anger and resentment, and try to be emotionally regular? I mean, it doesn't fit. It's impossible. We need in each of our relationships to develop them positively. So that contributes to our emotional and intellectual regulation. And if we can't do it in the relationship we have, perhaps we need to do something about that relationship, to get counseling or some way to develop a closer, nurturing kinds of relationship. Now, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship, by the way. It can be a sponsor relationship, a friend relationship, a neighbor relationship, an AA or a 12-step relationship. These things need to be in positive ways. So, for instance, if I have the idea of criticizing, gossiping about someone else, or criticizing someone else, I then am moving away from emotional regulation. Something about anger and threatening and all of these things and forcing that comes out of me when I do those things. So I always need to be mindful about positive relationships.
John,
yep.
Can you make the slides bigger? People are having a hard time reading the words.
Oh.
Can you do that?
I think I might be able to do that.
I know you can. I think it's down at the bottom on the right.
How's
there,
that?
see? Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. Another thing is we have to find our purpose, this meaning and value in living. You ever wake up in the morning and think, oh, here's another day. I got to go to work. I got to clean the house, whatever it is you do. It's a got to, have to, must, need kinds of conversations you have with yourself. What's really true here is not that the language needs to be cleaned up, but somehow we've missed our meaning and value or our potential in life. We need to find our purpose. We need to understand what excites us, what gives us enthusiasm and a zest for living. So meaning and value in living is critical for emotional regulation. Other than that, we're pretending. Now, we talked about weaknesses already, and weaknesses are just weaknesses. They're nothing more than a characteristic. But what we want to learn is our relationship to them. In other words, develop coping and resiliency mechanisms to help us deal with the weaknesses that are in front of us. So it's not the weaknesses that we're attacking, it is the development and the mechanism on how to approach them and work through them. And the foundational piece in emotional sobriety is self-acceptance. Self-acceptance is the cornerstone of emotional sobriety, friends. If you don't have a degree of self-acceptance, you'll never achieve emotional sobriety or intellectual sobriety. And what does self-acceptance mean? Well, every one of us have an inner critic. And many of us pay explicit attention to the inner critic as if it was telling you the truth. And we suffer under the whip or the lash of this inner critic when we do something wrong or inappropriate, or we make a mistake, an honest mistake even. That inner critic has a voice in our life. And we start engaging with that inner critic as if what it was saying was true. And on close examination, what we begin to see is it's not even our voice. It's somebody else's voice. It's not us that's saying it. It's somebody else that's saying it. It could be your parents. It could be your coach. It could have been a teacher. It could have been a friend. Just repeating what I had heard. And you, as a little victim, or me as a little victim, are listening to this slave owner, if you like. To follow the dictates of a belief that we have about ourselves simply means we're not good enough. We're just not good enough. So this is a lash that each of us face every day. We have limited beliefs about ourselves. And, you know, some of it is completely understandable because each of us have history of being harmed and harming others. Some of us have history of trauma and causing trauma on others. Some of us have disastrous stories, what we've done. Each of us understand each of that. And what we have bought into is the idea that's who we are. And that's not who we are. We had done those things, but that's not who we are. So emotional sobriety is to begin to separate a lot of these ideas that we've collapsed into one thing, as one ball. Okay, just checking the time. I want to make sure that I do this on time. So what is emotional sobriety? I'm talking around it. I'm talking about approaching it. I'm talking about away from it. I'm talking about all of these things. But what is it? Here's my definition. Emotional sobriety or emotional regulation refers to the ability to manage and regulate one's emotions healthily and adaptively effectively. It involves being able to identify, understand, and cope with one's emotions, as well as being able to recognize and respond appropriately to the emotions of others. Emotional sobriety also entails managing intense or challenging emotions without resorting to unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as substance abuse or self-harm. Emotional sobriety or emotional regulation is essential to mental and emotional well-being, allowing individuals to navigate life's challenges with greater resilience, positivity, and emotional balance. So, what does emotional dysregulation look like? And the reason I put this in is this: we got to know what we're dealing with. The body and the mind have a resilience that is absolutely remarkable. In other words, we can get used to feeling bad. And once we get used to feeling bad, we think that's really feeling okay. So we're adaptable, we adjust. And yet we don't realize when we're having a particular experience that experience could be a lot better for us. We're prepared to live in that experience because we're used to it and become comfortable with it. So the reason I'm getting into sticking the nose in this is I want you to be familiar with what it looks like. So you can ask yourself, do I experience these things? And hopefully you do not, but you may think, yeah, I've experienced these things. So here's some symptoms, if you like. I remain socially awkward, shy, if you like, removed, distant, different. I don't fit in. All of these kinds of words and phrases that we're used to using. So even in sobriety, you might find me hanging around the walls, or the last row in the seats, or sitting by myself. I'm alone, isolated. Prefer to be that way, by the way, because it makes me uncomfortable to be around people. Emotionally isolated. In other words, I'm distant from my fellows because I'm not going to tell you what I'm really thinking and feeling. I'm ashamed. I'm embarrassed. You might not like me if you really knew who I was. I'm going to hide. I'm rigid. In other words, I'm so certain about my things that I'm going to tell you what to do and how to go about doing it because I'm sure. Black and white. Certainty. I'm loud. I used to consider myself a blowfish. You know what I mean? I get into the room and I would blow up. And I'd be loud and I'd be laughing and I'd be telling jokes and slapping people on the back as a younger man. And I look back at that young man, I was trying to hide. I was overcompensating for my awkwardness. And everybody thought I was a great guy. Isn't he funny? But I'm sure I irritated people as well. But that's how I expressed and overcompensated for this remaining socially awkward and emotionally isolated. I compensated. Become demanding and controlling. You see, in my world, you do this, you do that. I order you around. I command. I force. I use whatever mechanism it is to get my own way. I have a loud inner critic. I have limiting self-beliefs. I say to myself, I can't do that. That's too hard for me. I don't think I'm very good at that. Therefore, I won't even try. My me story says I am not good enough in that area. Now, can you imagine that a human being can reduce himself to that point without even trying? This is what happens in dysregulation. Distracted. In other words, I can't be present. It's too painful for me. I can't be with the present moment. It's too hard. So it's easier to be off on a TV show or to read a book or even go to a meeting. I can be distracted. Maybe I'm running away from a dysfunctional family just to be in the presence of people that don't ask those hard questions. So I get distracted. I'm avoiding. See, this is a tendency and pattern I have to watch out for myself every day is avoidance. I tend to avoid. I'm restless, irritable, and discontented. I'm anxious, I'm stressed, and I'm frustrated. These are just symptoms or breadcrumbs, if you're right, about some of the aspects about emotional dysregulation. So we've spent almost all of our time together, and we're going to continue doing this. For today is our time to be familiar with dysregulation before we move into correction. And the subsequent series that we'll provided through Patrick and Susie will begin with more of the ways in which to work towards emotional regulation. So the topic today was, is emotional sobriety a necessity or is it nice to have? After all, I'm sober. I don't act out and the police haven't been at my door. You know what I mean? I'm retired and I'm living all right. Is it really necessary to have emotional regulation? Or is it just a nice to have? The consequences are, according to science, are rather dramatic, by the way. And I'm just going to flip into my notes. I didn't do all the slides, friends. So you can see them okay, Susie? Okay. So cardiovascular issues. Now, I want you to get the physical consequences of what we're talking about there. We develop cardiovascular issues as a result of emotional dysfunction. Chronic stress and negative emotions can cause an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, which can increase the risk of heart disease, stroke, and other cardiovascular problems. This is what emotional dysregulation can bring. Digestive issues. Emotional dysfunction can also affect the digestive system that leads to stomach pain, diarrhea, and constipation. Third is the weakened immune system, chronic stress, negative emotions, making it hard on the body to fight infections and illnesses. Chronic pain. Emotional dysregulation can cause physical pain, particularly in muscles and joints. This is because stress and negative emotions can cause much muscle tension and inflammation. Sleep disturbances.
John, is there a list supposed to be showing? Because we only see what are the consequences.
Oh.
Can you advance to the next slide, I think?
Okay, just a second here. Yeah, for some reason I see. Some reason my screen share paused. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes. We're at sleep disturbances.
Yep, exactly. So negative emotions can disrupt sleep patterns, leading to insomnia and other sleep disorders. Weight gain, emotional dysfunction can lead to weight gain as stress and negative emotions can cause overeating and unhealthy food choices. And we all know something about substance abuse. We could be inviting secondary and other addictions as we continue the road of emotional dysregulation. So overall, emotional dysfunction can be a significant physical consequences and health problems. So it's more than a nice to have. It's a necessity for a life well lived. To be able to be free, to be able to handle and evolve in our emotions and see the value and benefits of them. So there's countless lifestyle problems in dealing with even unknown emotional dysfunction because it becomes part of how we think, feel, and behave. It all becomes part of that.
I have another favor to ask. Can you show page 9? Back up one. Is that 9?
This is 9 here.
Yeah, that's just what I want. Someone asked to see it.
Okay, I will be providing you with these notes, by the way. So if you're missing something, don't try to keep up with it. Just ask for the notes with Patrick or Susie, and I'll be giving them to you. Yeah, because there's a lot of information here. I mean, there's just a lot. And the reason why I'm doing this, by the way, is to really get you in the mindset of what we're moving away from and what we're moving towards. These are serious health consequences if we remain in our negative thinking and what we would call negative emotions. I don't like using the word negative emotions. I prefer to use emotions that we don't know how to deal with. These are serious health consequences for us. And we live in stress and anxiety, and we're right back to where we started. We're restless, irritable, and discontent. Perhaps we cover it up better than we did before, but we're still living that kind of life. So what I've done is this is where this has paid off for me in a sense that I suffered every one of these things, and I have many experiences that were absolute reversals to what my intentions were. And it's not fate, by the way. I don't believe it's necessarily fate. It has to do with how I feel, what I'm thinking about, what I believe in, and what I don't believe in. That brought me to, I'll be honest, 2 failed marriages, bankruptcies, loss of successful businesses I've had, because of this idea I needed more, I needed bigger, better, not because of any interest, but because of my emptiness, trying to fill that gap. So these are serious, significant things that's happened to me in life that didn't need to happen in life. But blinded by what I didn't know, that's what happened. So I learned how to deal with external and internal stressors. This is what I've learned to do. I learned methods and systems to help me process emotions without getting overwhelmed. You see, in our next series, what we're going to talk about, we're not going to talk about these things. I'm going to give you a how-to on how to start doing it, which is vital. I often think about people who say, well, just let it go. Well, if you're hearing that bit of advice, if you knew how to let it go, you wouldn't let it go, right? But sometimes when things are so emotionally charged, we don't know how to let it go. And what is missing out of that piece of advice is this is how to do it. The advice is fine, but as a result that they're talking about, what that person most needs is not the result, it needs the process. What's the process? What's my method? How do I train myself to let go of something that I am overwhelmed with? How to manage fear in my life? How to change my emotional positioning from critic to observer? How to increase my situational awareness? In other words, this is a big thing, to be aware of what experiences that's in front of me. How to use my strengths to increase my emotional responses, my practice to mindfulness, my practice in self-acceptance, increase positive relationships with my communication, and developing coping and resilient mechanisms and achieving my goals and success. So friends, I'm just going to wrap up here. There's a few more things, but I'm also at my hour. I am going to give you these notes. And if you like, I'll give you the slides if they're of value to you as well. And I thank you for your generous attention. What we've done is a deep dive kind of into what the problem is, and what's going to follow is what are the solutions.